The trip to the trailhead hadn't taken even an hour, the area being swarmed by hundreds of ponies adorned by the expected equipment and proper clothing for a long day in the sun. Saddlebags packed with more than one water bottle, sun hats to prevent the blazing heat from cooking them alive, sunglasses to save their eyes from the blinding reflection of the sun off the several rocks, binoculars to get a better view of certain spectacles, cameras for taking pictures, and for some, hiking materials. The trail began from the bottom of a long and wide canyon, extending out into a massive valley composed of sandstone, trees of all sorts, and a river that ran straight through the center of it. The sights all changed along the entire walk, and there were two options of travel. The one that Drifting and Shimmering planned to take, or the river path that extended for miles. Some ponies were set up to begin the more treacherous pathway, but the majority were planning the latter option, planning not to potentially die on that day. The line had been extended out to the main gate entrance upon Drifting and Shimmering's arrival, and only after waiting patiently for over an hour, were now setting up to enter past the entrance where the trail started. After paying a treacherous amount of 100 bits to gain entry, the couple finally made their way through and came to the site of a flat and narrow path composed of dirt with hoof rails off to each side. However, before that was a sign with a smorgasbord of important text that was required to read before taking a step onto the trail. Please read and follow the recommendations listed below. We are not responsible for any incompetence on your end if you choose to not. Stay within the boundaries of the hoof railing. Pack at least 3 bottles of water per pony before entering. Do not leave the trail. If the water is high, turn around and stay at least 20 yards away from the river. Watch for biological dangers such as snakes, bears, and unstable cliff edges. Respect other explorers' privacy and space. You are responsible for your own safety. Ponies have perished here. Don't let your life be lost here as well. It was intimidating to read, but the forecast had read clear skies, the river was at a safe level, and they didn't plan to go against a clear warning that this landscape had killed ponies before. Therefore, having read the sign carefully, the two began to walk forward and deeper into the canyon. It hadn't taken even 5 minutes before the first marvel the attraction had to offer came into view off to the left side of the main path. Off to the side, a sign describing the history and title of the site was placed, to which the two took a moment to stop and read. The attraction before their eyes was titled The Sea of Flowers, and it was a fitting one due to the fact it did look like so. The spectacle was a long stretch of land adorned by thousands of wildflowers off both sides of the river that ran down its center, the entirety of its body extending out beyond as far as the two could see. The cause of its existence was said to be due to the river nourishing the flowers beneath the surface, running through underground channels that extended for miles. The flowers adorning the top surface were ones that ran a life cycle of blooming each spring and wilting at the beginning of fall, but had the natural ability to grow back from the roots burrowed in the ground. A cycle that had been looping ever since its discovery hundreds of years prior non-stop, meaning ponies could only witness this natural phenomenon in between spring and fall. From the look of the flowers, it seemed like Drifting and Shimmering had come at the perfect time of the year, given there was no sign of the flowers beginning to wither.
No doubt what every pony said about this specific attraction is true. It feels like I'm looking at a painting, but it's not one at all.
It's majestic and somewhat magical that something like this can actually exist. Hard to believe there's even more sights like this to see further along the trail.
Shimmering turned her gaze to her husband's, a smile on her face.
Then it's probably best we get moving. We have to be out before dark, and given the entire trail goes on for 15 miles, we need to avoid stopping to look at attractions too much.
Gotcha. The next big sight isn't too far ahead. Just be sure to let me know if you need to stop and relax for a minute.
Shimmering nodded, then the two turned and began to walk further along the trail. Along their trek deeper into the wilderness, they came across many other wonders that made them stop and stare for just a minute, knowing it could be their only chance to see these natural formations in person for the rest of their lives. The first was a cave filled with massive crystals growing from the walls in all directions imaginable. Following that was a massive forest composed of ancient trees that had grown over 100 feet high, were as wide as the length of a school bus, and as sturdy as a mountain. As they'd walked the trail through said spectacle, it had felt as if giants were glaring down at them, curious about who had entered their domain. A feeling that was both intimidating and fascinating at the same time in their eyes. Past the forest, they came to a long and flat valley that was supposedly the point of the trail where it began to revert back to the trailhead. However, along the way back, it was said that the most popular attraction of the entire walk could be seen. The name Blackwood Trail wasn't just a title to catch ponies' interests. No, it had earned that title from the most bizarre sight that could be seen along the way back to the starting point at only the cost of an hour and a half of walking the main pathway. A massive patch of land composed of only blackened trees that were supposedly dead. The one attraction that was yet to be explained as to how it had come to be. The first guess was a forest fire, but after studies having been done to the trees, they were found to be alive and well. The black coloration had also been found to not have been caused by any force of nature like fire or lightning, and only after running hundreds of tests had the many arborists who had attempted to debunk the mystery hang up the towel. The mysterious nature of the attraction was what drew ponies to this place, and it was understandable as to why, hence why it had been earned the title it currently adorns. Having walked for so long, Drifting and Shimmering had decided to take a short break at the highest point of the entire trail. Benches were provided for the adventurers, and the two were not the only ponies stopping to take a breather. The rest area was nothing more than a flat surface no bigger than a casual driveway, with 4 benches nailed into the ground to keep them steady, Drifting leading his partner to the closest one to take a seat. Upon their approach, another stallion seated off to the left side of the seat moved quickly to move his luggage from the opposite side onto the ground. He was dressed in what you'd expect for a long day of navigating through the wilderness, his mane dark brown and his fur light tan with clearly expensive sunglasses resting on his muzzle. "Please, don't mind me," he said respectfully, gesturing to Drifting that Shimmering could join him on the bench. With gentle care and caution, Shimmering seated herself and took a minute to breathe. Knowing his wife was in a state of exhaustion, Drifting worked fast to collect one of the water bottles they'd packed from his saddlebags, holding it out to Shimmering to take and drink from. She didn't even hesitate and accepted the offer, taking the canister and beginning to guzzle down what she needed at the moment. By the time she had released the tip of the bottle from between her lips, she drank half of the inner contents, allowing herself to sit up and relax for a minute or two. "I don't usually see pregnant mares out here, especially at this stage in their pregnancy," the stallion commented. "I'm assuming you underestimated the trail's impact on the body?"
You could say that. I'd always heard that this walk was rather flat and easy to travel.
Well, it used to be, up until an earthquake a couple years ago. The tectonic plates that run through these valleys shifted and caused the trail to become more taxing, going from straight and flat to more of an uphill and downhill roller coaster ride. Don't worry though, the rest of the way is pretty easy on the body, seeing that the earthquake didn't hit the areas along the rest of the path that badly. The stallion reached down to grab something from his bag, unzipping the compartment furthest back and pulling out something rectangular. Upon him handing out the 2 objects, both Drifting and Shimmering jumped in surprise, the 2 offerings being granola bars. "Here, for the rest of the road," the stallion stated. "My name's Buckson, by the way." Taking the delicacies from Buckson, Drifting worked to introduce both himself and Shimmering as a display of gratitude.
Thanks. I'm Drifting Star, and this is my wife, Shimmering Moonlight.
"Pleasure. Now, I suggest you 2 eat up and get moving as soon as you're done."
Why the rush?
Drifting questioned, a slight shiver going down his spine at the sudden statement from Buckson. "There's a storm on the way, and if you read the sign before getting on the trail, you should know that the rivers below get dangerously high when rain comes." Drifting gazed into the sky to test the statement from Buckson as true or false, finding it being the latter upon seeing no sign of any cloud in sight.
I see no sign of a storm in sight, Mr. Buckson. I think you're mistaken.
Buckson shook his head. I've navigated these mountains long enough to know just how unpredictable they can be, and even if it seems no storm is near, the tides can turn in an instant. You can choose to believe me or not, but believe me when I say that you should take caution further onward. Drifting couldn't help but feel Buckson was being sincere, but he checked the forecast before deciding to come here today, and no storm had been predicted. However, despite the whole declaration of a storm being within their midst, he decided to heed Buckson's warning of being cautious along the rest of the way to the end of the road.
I'll keep your warning in mind.
Drifting assured, ripping open his granola bar and starting to engulf it out of his clear hunger. Shimmering followed her husband's actions, and in less than a minute, the snacks were gone and on their way to digestion. Following that, the couple worked onto their hooves again and began to work their way back to the starting point of the Blackwood Trail. Buckson hadn't been lying about the way back being much more friendly on their hooves, the road being mostly flat and accompanied by many more wonders. They'd passed the very area that gave the trail its name not even 10 minutes after wishing farewell to Buckson at the summit of the path, having stopped briefly to just look and ponder their own theories on why the phenomenon even existed. After that, they worked further down towards the most dangerous part of the entire experience, the main river being less than 10 feet from where they had to walk to proceed to the end of the walkway. What was worse was that out of absolute nowhere, the sky had become adorned with gray and black clouds that were beginning to amplify the sound of thunder. Buckson's prediction had been true after all, but Drifting hadn't let that get to him, knowing that despite the storm being above him and Shimmering, he had to get both of them to the end of the trail before it started to rain. He kept a close eye on the water with every step he took ahead of Shimmering, trying his best to keep his hooves steady and demeanor calm. However, upon hearing the boom of thunder pierce his ears and the chill of raindrops begin to fall from the sky onto his flesh, did his hooves begin to move at a faster pace. Lightning came next, striking like a whip from the clouds above and making the two jump in fear and surprise. Now they were aware that they were in a very precarious situation, getting more and more dangerous with each passing second. One raindrop had turned into hundreds in seconds, and the thunder and lightning began to blast from above once every 3 seconds. The situation had escalated in a time period of only 10 minutes, Drifting beginning to search his mind for the best solution to the growing potential danger. He could see the once calm river starting to grow into a raging rapid, and that meant that the water would more than likely jump over the sides of the banking and begin to flood the area around them. In other words, the trail was slowly in the process of becoming part of the river, and once that happened, Drifting and Shimmering would have no choice but to pray for the water to not engulf them entirely, or lead them in the right direction towards the end of the trail. As if some force were taunting them, their predicament only grew more detrimental upon the wind beginning to rage and throw off their balance, causing them to nearly collapse onto the hard ground. Somehow they kept their hooves straight, hoping to see the trail's path come to a point where it got them to higher ground. However, traversing the road became harder by the second, the river having already elevated above the banking and starting to encroach towards them like a predator stalking its helpless prey. It was clear that the rain wasn't stopping anytime soon, nor was the river widening out towards them going to retreat back to its waterway. So Drifting quit trying to fight against Mother Nature and turned to Shimmering to state the only solution he could come up with to the situation.
We are going to exhaust ourselves if we continue like this, Shimmering.
He shouted directly, hoping for Shimmering to hear him through the harsh winds and rain.
Then what do we do?
If the water reaches us, we need to grab hold of the railing and hang on until the storm passes. There's no telling where the river will lead, so we can only stay within this area and wait until it's safe.
It was a gamble, but a reasonable one. There was nowhere else to go, and they couldn't turn around and get back to higher ground by the time the river would reach their position. They could only grab hold of what they could and hang on for dear life, and pray that this storm would end sooner than later. Shimmering nodded in agreement, turning her head towards the body of water less than 5 yards from the trail and readying herself to grab onto the railing next to her if she needed to. The storm continued to rage and build the water level higher up to their position, assuring the couple that there was no possibility of the rain relenting anytime soon. Therefore, upon the river's body touching their hooves, they took a light hold of the railing and watched furthermore as the water level grew more and more. In no more than 5 minutes, they were leg deep in the river, still briefly hanging onto their only source of safety. Another minute later, the water had escalated up to their necks, still able to stand steadily on the ground beneath them. Another 60 seconds. Nothing but their heads were above the water's surface, and now they were officially gripping the metal bars meant to keep every pony that treaded this trail safe from falling into the river. The current beneath the body of water made the task nearly impossible, attempting to pull them further downstream to an unknown destination likely far from the vicinity of the Blackwood Trail. The rain only made it worse, obscuring their vision and making it hard to keep their breathing steady. Not to mention that as the river's height grew, the harder it was to hang on to the railing and stay afloat. It was becoming very apparent that if they wanted to survive, they had to eventually let go. Both Drifting and Shimmering knew it, their muzzles and eyes barely above the surface anymore. To assure that they'd stay together, Drifting tapped Shimmering's closest hoof underwater to grab tightly onto him. As much as she didn't want to allow fate to decide where they'd go next, she knew it was do or die. Therefore, she followed her husband's gesture, grabbed onto his free hoof as tight as possible, and in a sudden flash of fear and the will to live, they both let go. Upon letting go, they were instantly pulled toward the center as if they were being sucked into a vacuum. They couldn't think, see, or move as the current led them further downstream. All they could do was hold on and pray that they'd find a shoreline soon. They were dunked underneath and atop the river hundreds of times, struggling to breathe and catch sight of their surroundings over a time of what had felt like eternity. The force of the current, raindrops pounding down on their heads, and the raging of the rapids was overpowering to the point where eventually Drifting's vision suddenly faded into nothing but a void of black as the river continued to guide them to an unknown destination far beyond the borders of the Blackwood Trail.
Come on. Come on. Damn it, don't you die on me. Get up.
Drifting's eyes shot open, quickly following with heavy coughs and water escaping his lungs and mouth. A blinding light greeted him in his wake, Shimmering being the second thing in his line of sight as he sat up and slowly worked his way back to reality. His head was pounding, and his entire body felt as if it were soaked. A flash of what had occurred prior suddenly playing out before his eyes rapidly. Only after coming to full realization of what had happened did he get a full look at his surroundings. All around him was a sandy shore that led to the sea, his wife in a state of relief that he was okay, and a long and wide collection of trees that looked dead straight up from the shore. He rubbed his head in an attempt to soothe the headache that felt like the equivalent of a nasty hangover, getting onto his hooves and turning to Shimmering.
I'm okay. My head just hurts.
Shimmering gave him no warning and immediately embraced him, her heart having nearly dropped at the struggle to wake him from death's grasp.
Promise me you'll never do that to me again. I thought I lost you.
Drifting rubbed the back of her neck softly as a way of comforting her, feeling her tears stain his own back.
I promise. And I'm sorry I left you for a minute.
He pulled away from her to give her an assuring kiss, to which Shimmering accepted and allowed herself to enjoy for a minute before pulling from it. Once their seal was broken, Drifting followed up with the question Shimmering had expected to come.
Is our son okay?
Shimmering nodded, placing her left front hoof along the side of her bulged belly.
He's still kicking and moving around. I got lucky that I didn't hit anything on the way to wherever we are now.
Drifting smiled at the fortunate news, then shifted his gaze to the sight up from the shore that gave him an unsettling feeling. Trees as black as tar, with no leaves adorning their branches that stretched out for miles. A sight that seemed eerie and unnatural to exist in reality, but here it was before their eyes. However, Drifting refused to let his fears get in the way of them finding a way to get back home, so he shrugged all of his fears aside and took hold of the situation with an iron hoof.
I'm going to see if I can see any sort of radio towers nearby. You just take a minute to rest, okay?
Says the stallion who just woke up from nearly dying of drowning.
I'm okay to look around. I promise I'll be careful.
Alright, honey. Don't go too far.
He nodded, then turned and headed toward the outline of the strange trees. Upon meeting the barrier of the practical forest, he was shocked at the sight before him. Black trees, endless, extending for miles on end beyond what his eyes could make out. It was strange beyond anything he'd ever seen before, up until he realized he had seen something of the same profile before. A realization that gave him a sliver of hope that their situation may not be as dire as they'd originally thought. The very site that gave the Blackwood Trail its name.
Hey, Shimmering. I don't think we're too far away from the Blackwood Trail.
Really?
Yeah, I think we're near the main attraction of the entire place. Take a look at the trees. Don't they look familiar?
Shimmering slowly worked her way towards the outline of the supposed main site of the trail they'd previously been on, finding her train of thought being the same as her husband's. If they were near the trail, that meant they weren't too far from the trailhead and civilization. Hope burned in their hearts that some upper power had spared them an unfortunate predicament of being lost in the wilderness. However, they still had to take their next course of action with caution and proper logic, because while it seemed they were near the trail, there was no guarantees.
Let's not jump the gun, honey. We're still out in the middle of nowhere, with no sense of direction or awareness of where we actually are.
Drifting nodded, fully aware that if they just assumed they were near the trail, they could easily get lost and die from either starvation or dehydration. It was best to play the game of outsmarting nature wisely and carefully.
I know. It's nearly nighttime anyways, so it might be best we call it a night. We're both exhausted and need rest to get through this.
While Shimmering wasn't keen on sleeping in the wilderness of Equestria, she couldn't deny that her husband was right. It had been a long day, and they both needed rest if they were going to survive this. Therefore, she agreed with a nod of her head and a sudden yawn that came from nowhere. Luckily, Drifting had done good work at making sure his saddlebags were tight against his body, because he'd packed a fire starter just in case of something like this. With his partner knowing that they needed to rest up, he quickly found the fire starter, dried it off as best he could, and after collecting some wood from nearby and making a circle of medium-sized rocks, had a blaze going before the sun had gone down. A fire would definitely help them to get through the night, along with them cuddling one another to keep them somewhat warm. They both knew tomorrow was going to be a long day, so they did their best to get comfy and held each other close before closing their eyes to a long and restless night. A splash from the tide crawling up the shoreline was what woke Drifting the next morning, opening his eyes to the same visual he'd seen before closing them the night prior. He hadn't slept a peep, and his back felt as stiff as a board as he got to his hooves and rubbed his eyes clean of any debris. However, upon noticing something that wasn't obvious at first, he immediately went from calm to panicked instantly. Shimmering wasn't in sight, and considering they were in the middle of nowhere, anything could have happened to her.
Shimmering?
He called out in worry, but was immediately relieved upon hearing his wife's voice answer just a little further down the shore.
Over here.
He quickly hurried to her, finding her in seconds hunched over and slightly pale in color, a sight he'd seen quite a few times over the past months of their foal's growth. His assumption was proven true upon the sound of her dry heaving meeting his ears. Morning sickness.
You okay?
He asked softly, to which Shimmering turned to look at him.
Yeah. Just another bad morning. I'd appreciate it if you'd grab me some water.
Drifting didn't say anything and just hurried back to their temporary camp to grab one of the water bottles they'd packed. Once again, he was thankful that he'd been absolutely sure to make it so they wouldn't lose any of their supplies in an emergency as such. The water bottles still sealed and intact, as if nothing had happened. Once he had one of the bottles in his grasp, he quickly rushed back to Shimmering and handed it to her to drink. She took one big drink and swished the liquid violently throughout her mouth, desperate to get the disgusting taste of vomit out of it. Once she felt confident she'd rinsed thoroughly, she spat the liquid onto the sandy ground, then followed up with a couple of swigs of the H2O that she was going to need for the trip ahead of her. After her hydration was satisfied, she turned to Drifting with a smile.
Thank you. And good morning.
Good morning. I hate to be pushy, but if we plan to cover a lot of ground and find a potential way back home, we need to get out of here as fast as we can.
Don't worry. I already prepared all my things before you woke up. I'm assuming you didn't get any sleep either?
Nope. The fact we're in the wilderness and that there's hundreds of different dangers out here had me awake the entire night.
Well, we made it through one night, and weirdly enough, I don't hear any sounds of any sign of life out here.
That's good. I'd rather there be nothing with sharp teeth and an appetite for ponies anywhere close by. Lady Luck is really looking out for us right now, so let's hope she leads us out of these woods and back home.
Shimmering nodded in agreement, then followed her husband back to their camp. From there, they packed up what they needed to, smoldered out the fire, and began to tread further into the bizarre forest that they assumed was the attraction they'd seen yesterday. However, once they were deep enough into the unsettling environment, it was starting to become clear that this place wasn't something natural. There was no signs of wildlife, not even something like a deer or even a rabbit. Even the blackened trees were non-vacant of something as simple as ants or termites. Not even bugs of any sort wandered to the floor of the forest, nor was there even the sound of any kind of birds or squirrels. It was dead, as if it was a place that no pony should have ever wandered into, and it only got worse as it became apparent that their assumption of being close to the trail became more and more incorrect. There wasn't even the slightest sound of a river nearby, and that wasn't good for their situation, seeing they only had so much to spare. Drifting had been sure to keep himself on a straight path, but upon him walking upon his own hoofprints after hours of supposedly walking a straight line, it was clear that they were now lost. Their cheerful and positive attitudes they'd started with that morning were slowly but surely starting to turn into fear and dread. It was as if they'd gone in a big circle, only to find nothing but the sight of the same hundreds of thousands of pitch-black trees.
How the hell is that even possible? I could have sworn I made sure not to take any turns. I'm absolutely sure of it.
Honey, are we lost?
No, Shimmering. We just went in a circle somehow. We can always follow my tracks back to the shoreline. But I still don't understand how I could have ended up back here.
Deep down, he was panicking, but he had to keep himself calm for Shimmering's sake. He took a deep breath and looked up to the sky to determine the best decision for them to make in their current predicament. The sun was nearing the west end of the sky, meaning they hadn't just walked a few hours, but more like 10 or more. It would be dark in no more than 2 hours, meaning they had to find the shoreline and go back at it again tomorrow.
Let's get back to the shore. It's going to be dark soon, so let's go back, get some rest, and try again tomorrow.
Shimmering nodded in agreement, her hooves feeling like they were made of jello, and her back aching from the extra bundle of weight resting inside of her. Drifting began to follow his tracks back out of the woods, which should have taken no more than 20 minutes to meet the end of the tree line. However, after walking for longer than that, Drifting had realized that he'd made a terrible mistake. There was no sign of a shoreline in sight, nor could he hear the sound of any flowing body of water from any direction. To add insult to injury, their sunlight was nearly gone, and they were completely and utterly lost in a forest that gave every bit of a sense of them being unwelcome. They were in a living nightmare with no hope of waking up from it in sight.
Drifting, where's the shoreline? It's getting too dark to see anything.
Drifting knew his hooves were tied instantly, but he didn't want to scare his wife. He was scared out of his wits, and had been ever since he'd somehow found his tracks again. He knew he had to give her an answer, but didn't know how to give her one without freaking her out and causing stress for their son.
I don't know, Shimmering. I don't know how we got turned around, but we did. And I'm sorry to say it, but we're lost.
He answered truthfully, having surrendered to trying to keep the facts that they were clearly lost under the rug. Shimmering felt her stomach twist at the truth, but knowing the worst thing to do was panic, she took a deep breath and addressed her husband.
Honey, don't blame yourself. You're doing all you can to get us out of here, and that's all you can do. Let's stop for the night and take turns watching for any dangers. Walking in the dark will only make our situation worse.
Drifting was surprised at the reply, not having expected Shimmering to have responded so calmly. Everything she'd said was true, and it was clearly best for them to stop and try again when they could see their path. Therefore, he sighed and nodded in agreement to her suggestion, planting his rear onto the ground and taking off his saddlebags. Shimmering followed suit, then allowed herself to lay down and relax as best she could. Drifting wasn't even going to debate which of them would take first watch, having enough logic that pregnant mares needed rest to assure a proper and healthy birth.
Rest up, Shimmering. I'll take the first watch.
I assumed so, but you're not taking the whole night. You need sleep as much as I do. So 3 hours at most between the both of us. Got it?
He nodded, knowing he couldn't argue with her. As a way to keep his back comfy, he used his saddlebags as a practical pillow, laid back against a tree, and turned all of his senses up to 10. Shimmering rested her head in his lap, and was asleep in minutes upon closing her eyes. Now alone in still silence and near pitch black, Drifting prepared himself for a long 3 hours, praying that the next day would bring them better results. The previous night had been the quietest night in Drifting's life, the entire forest being dead silent the entire 3 hours he was up. Not even crickets accompanied the stillness, proving that this place was definitely not something of a regular nature, and that raised many questions in Drifting's mind. What had happened here? Where was here? Those were the two most prominent ones repeating constantly, but no answer ever came as he rose from the forest floor back onto his hooves. Once again, there was no sign of Shimmering nearby, to which he assumed was another case of morning sickness. It was clear there was absolutely nothing dwelling within the forest, so his fear of wolves or bears attacking them wasn't even a concern anymore. However, he'd still not rather be alone in an unsettling environment alone, so he worked to call out for his wife.
Shimmering?
Over here.
Called Shimmering from not too far away, to which Drifting worked his way towards, making sure to create a trail back by dragging his hooves along the ground. Shimmering came into view in seconds, standing close to a cliff that had a fall of easily over 100 feet down. It frightened him, seeing Shimmering wasn't usually the type to get close to edges that could potentially be unstable. Therefore, he hurried to her position, continuing to drag his hooves to avoid getting lost.
Can you please stop giving me a heart attack every morning we're out here?
She didn't respond immediately, seeming to be frozen in place and still as if she'd come across something abnormal.
Everything okay? You look as if you saw a ghost or something.
Would you call me crazy if I said I think I did?
Drifting raised an eyebrow, having not expected a response like that.
What do you mean? Shimmering, are you telling me a ghost supposedly led you here?
I was getting a drink from one of the spare bottles in your saddlebags until I heard something like a filly's giggle. It scared me half to death, but upon investigating, I saw what looked like a small filly trotting through the trees. I followed as far as I could comfortably judge being able to find my way back, and that point was to here. However, I don't remember falling asleep, because I only just woke up to the sound of your voice calling out.
He put a hoof on her shoulder in comfort, her response having made a chill go down his spine, seeing he didn't think she was lying. It was absolutely clear now that this bizarre and unnatural place wasn't a place they should remain any longer. They needed to leave as soon as possible.
Let's get out of this forest. I don't think it's good for either of us to be here any longer.
Shimmering nodded, turning to work her way back to their camp alongside her husband. However, after not even taking 2 steps, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something in the distance. Something that seemed like a potential flicker of hope of getting back home.
Wait, Drifting, what is that?
Shimmering questioned, turning and pointing her hoof out beyond the cliff edge.
What's what?
That big gray thing out there. It looks like some sort of facility. It could be our way out of here.
Following her hoof out, Drifting quickly spotted exactly what she was pointing at. It was out beyond the furthest tree line and just barely visible to the naked eye. A tall and wide structure in the shape of a dome that resembled something like a facility, gray in coloration and appearing out of the ordinary. However, despite it being strange in nature, it could indeed possibly be their ticket out of the equestrian wilderness. It was a gamble, but it was worth the risk in a situation as such. This discovery had been the only sign of life they'd seen in nearly 2 days, and if there was life in this supposed facility, that meant they could go home.
Considering it's the only thing we've seen that could have a radio or phone to get home, I'm all for it. However, I'm not the one carrying a foal, and it's likely going to take all day to get there. Do you think you can handle a long travel?
If it potentially means getting out of this hell, I'm willing to endure it. Do you seriously think I'm going to stay in these creepy woods while you go off and potentially get lost? I'm not staying here longer than I need to be.
She'd clearly made up her mind, to which Drifting nodded his head and smiled.
All right, then let's get the hell out of here.
He answered, turning and beginning to lead Shimmering back to the camp. The entire way back, all he could think of was what Shimmering had stated. Had it been a hallucination due to lack of hunger, or had she really been led to that place by a ghost? The fact that she'd said that, along with the uneasiness of these woods, just gave him the creeps. He felt like he was in one of those horror films being stalked by some kind of force that he couldn't see, and it only got worse every second he was still in that place. Once they had packed up and started their tedious trek to what they were hoping to be their ticket back home, Drifting's sense of disturbia only got worse as they got closer to the structure. Upon an estimated 500 yards out, they had started to see things that were unnatural to their current environment. They'd found signs of life, but not the ones you'd like to see. They'd come across a railroad that had long since been obscured by weeds and rust, stumbled upon what had once been an operational dirt road, spotted a treehouse that had been destroyed by time, and not far from that, a wagon that had once carried a variety of things. These were all clear signs that spelled out that this place had once been inhabited by ponies. It just wasn't easy to determine when said settlement had been abandoned by its civilians, and the closer they got to the massive dome, the more they began to feel as if the reason it had been abandoned had to do with said structure. It all got even more eerie upon the massive facility being surrounded by a rusted gate, meaning that it was clear that it had been closed off for a reason. However, what was weird was that there were no danger or no trespassing signs posted. So what was the story of this place?
This is strange. It's very clear there was a town or city once here, but how would they close it off?
I don't know nor care to know. All I know is that there's definitely no ponies around here to help us.
Hey, I never said I wanted to hop the fence. If something is fenced off, it means that no pony should enter for a certain reason. I'm not like those idiots in horror movies.
Good. That being said, I think it's best we take a break and think about our next move.
Drifting nodded, taking off his saddlebags and taking a seat against a nearby tree. Shimmering followed, taking a seat next to her husband and allowing herself a moment of relaxation.
Can you hand me one of the water bottles, please?
All right, but be sure to take it easy. There's no telling when or if we will even find a river or any water source out here.
I'll be easy.
Drifting nodded, then got into his saddlebags to search for one of the water bottles he'd originally packed. Once he found one, he handed it to Shimmering and watched as she took 3 small drinks from it. After she'd quenched her own thirst, Drifting allowed himself some swigs of the precious liquid as well, his body clearly on the verge of dehydration. After he finished, he returned their most important resource to their home in his saddlebags, then sat back against the tree. He allowed himself a moment to think about their next decision in hopefully getting home, but deep down, he had a feeling that they weren't ever going to get out of the equestrian wilderness. They could only hold out for so long with what they had, and soon the side effects of hunger would start to take over. He didn't want to give up, but the chances of finding help or civilization out here were slim to none. Shimmering pulled him from his thoughts of hopelessness, saying something that made him smile.
Drifting! His sun is kicking.
He opened his eyes and gazed down at Shimmering's exposed bulge, noticing a small bump pushing outward. He placed his hoof atop the bump, a sudden feeling of a light kick meeting it after a couple of seconds.
He's a strong colt.
Shimmering put her right hoof atop her husband's, her gaze meeting his.
He sure is. Just like his daddy.
She complimented, causing Drifting's heart to skip a beat. While their situation felt hopeless, he could see that his son was somehow telling him to stay strong. He couldn't abandon hope, because Shimmering needed him most right now. He needed to keep going for Shimmering and his unborn son. He smiled, his hope reignited and burning strong.
Yep, just like his daddy.
That's the spirit.
Shimmering finished, giving her husband a light peck on the lips. It may have been short and sweet, but it was enough to motivate Drifting to move forward. Something that he had needed to get back up and keep trying to find a way back home. Outside of the sweet and bright moment, a sound suddenly cut through the thin breeze blowing through the trees. Something that sounded unnatural and non-pony in every possible way. Then, it was accompanied by the sound of slow steps no more than 20 yards out, Shimmering having spotted the source and being shocked at what she was seeing. It was a filly, but not just any filly. It was the exact one she'd seen before. However, upon looking at the pony more clearly, she was immediately questioning many things of how this child was even moving. She was missing many chunks of flesh and muscle. Her ribs were visible, and her teeth were sharp, jagged, and stained with dried blood. The only thing she could possibly think of that would resemble this was a zombie. But zombies were only fictional creatures from horror films, right? Drifting didn't even want to test the waters, slowly moving his right hoof to the pocket where he kept his bear spray.
Shimmering, don't move a muscle. When I say run, do not even hesitate to run. I'll only get one chance to stun it.
But what if she's just a filly that's hurt and lost?
Those types of injuries would have killed her by now. I don't know what it is, but it only has bad intentions.
With the bear spray in his grasp, he flicked off the cap out of the filly's sight, preparing for the worst. He only had one chance to hit the creature's eyes, so he had to be sure to make it count.
Ready?
With a very slow nod of her head, Shimmering got ready to jump and trot as fast as possible. Her heart raced along with Drifting's, time seeming to slow as she awaited the command from her husband. The creature was 10 feet from them now, its blood-red eyes stalking them like a hawk, and its raspy growl causing sweat to seep from their pores out of fear. 9 feet, 8 feet, 7 feet, 6 feet, 5 feet.
Run!
Shimmering bolted like lightning from the ground and began to trot as fast as her body would allow, Drifting having released the nasty dose of bear spray directly into the eyes of the creature. He'd hit perfectly and, like his wife, had taken off as fast as he could in Shimmering's direction, following her hoofprints and reaching her in little time. The monstrous pony had emitted a horrifying wail of pain upon the spray temporarily blinding its vision, the noise being unlike anything either Drifting or Shimmering had heard before. It wasn't anything of pony nature, and Drifting had a sinking feeling that it was related to the civilization that had once existed in these woods. Neither knew where they were going, but they stayed along the fence line to avoid getting lost and losing their only resources they had in their current situation. However, they halted to a stop upon seeing the worst possible thing they could have stumbled upon. Another creature just like the other one. This one was a stallion in the same condition as the filly, the only difference being that it was clearly of an older age. Drifting and Shimmering immediately diverted their direction, turning right and hastily trotting back the other way. Upon the sound of the same raspy roar emitting from the direction of the stallion monster, they knew they were in much more danger than before. They could hear heavy hoofsteps behind them, catching up quickly and efficiently, and that caught both of them by surprise. How could a decrepit corpse like that run at a higher speed than theirs? That wasn't important, and to hopefully throw the stallion telling them off pace, they turned right at the front of one of the many trees. The plan was for the fragile husk to smack right into it and give them time to get away, listening as the sound of a hollow bang just behind them met their ears. They stopped temporarily to catch their breath, looking back to see the monster in many separate pieces after colliding into the sturdy body of the tree they'd set as a trap. However, their victory was short, watching in horror as something that should only exist in fiction began to happen. The monster's separated limbs were beginning to reassemble themselves, the ligaments and tendons extending outward and pulling each other back to the main body against the tree. They were in absolute shock and horror at the sight, turning and beginning to run again. This couldn't be real. This whole situation had to just be a bad dream. However, no matter how many times they tried to open their eyes or do something that would wake them up, they remained in this place that felt like the pits of hell. How could they stop something that could just revive itself? The simple answer was that they couldn't, and as they continued to run, the only solution that came to their heads was to run forward or jump the fence. Even under the influence of adrenaline, their lungs and muscles were burning for relief, and as if fate were taunting them, up ahead of them, another creature of the same type came into view. This one was a mare, but they didn't even have time to look at it thoroughly as they turned right yet again. However, that direction was obstructed by yet another one of the monsters, and as soon as they tried to turn another direction, another creature was waiting for them. They were surrounded, and it was clear that these things were intelligent and could communicate. They had pissed off an entire herd of these things, and now they only had one way to go.
We need to jump the fence. Every other way is blocked.
Are you fucking insane? You want to go near that thing we clearly aren't supposed to?
It's the only path that isn't obstructed by monsters that have an appetite for our flesh. Unless you've got an alternative route that doesn't involve us getting killed, jumping the fence is our best direction.
Shimmering had no answer to Drifting's counter-argument, knowing he was right. Her hooves were tied, so she had no choice but to surrender.
What about our supplies? We can't survive without them.
Once these things stop chasing us, I'll hop the fence again and get them back.
She couldn't argue, knowing it was do or die. Therefore, she just agreed and turned toward the fence.
You go first. You can hop over using my back as support.
Knowing the fact that she couldn't make the jump being pregnant, she only nodded and allowed Drifting to assist her over the obstacle. She quickly climbed atop her husband's back, put all of her energy into her back legs, and jumped as high as she could. She managed to get a good hop high enough to clear the fence, landing on the opposite side with a mild thump while supporting her belly to keep her child safe from harm. Knowing his wife was safe and the creatures approaching fast, Drifting backed away from the fence line, focused all of his remaining energy into his rear hooves, ran back at the fence, then leapt as hard as he could from the ground forward. He barely escaped an assault from one of the monsters by a hair, clearing the obstacle and landing on all fours. Shimmering quickly met up with her husband, turning her gaze back to the fence and hoping for the predators on the other side to not have the ability to climb or jump over it. However, she was met with something she wasn't expecting at all, watching the creatures that were originally hungry for their flesh and blood retreat back into the forest. A sight that made the fur on the back of her neck stand up straight. It reminded her of when a pack of wolves stand down from a meal to allow their alpha male to have the first bite of the kill. Did that mean that these monstrosities were so scared of what she thought was a facility that they'd abandoned satisfying their hunger? Everything was getting more terrifying by the second, and all she wanted was to go home. However, They weren't in the same situation as before anymore, but something even worse. Their water source was now on the other side of the fence with their predators. They were nowhere close to civilization, and now there were bigger questions in their minds. What in the world did they just encounter? Are these things connected to whatever happened to the original civilization that was supposedly abandoned? Where did they go next?
You okay?
Drifting's voice pulled her from her thoughts, having gotten overwhelmed by what she'd just gone through.
I think so. I'm more lost than anything else.
Drifting responded by hugging her gently, comforting her as best he could.
It's okay. They're gone now. I don't know what the hell just happened. All I know is that we need to get out of here as soon as possible.
Shimmering didn't say anything else, only buried her face into her husband's chest. She was scared, lost, hungry, and exhausted, but she couldn't close her eyes to slumber after what she'd just seen. It was like she was in a real horror movie, but this was reality, and these creatures that appeared dead and demonic were not hallucinations or her eyes playing tricks on her. They were completely 100% real and watching her and drifting like hawks. The remaining daylight was slowly beginning to dim away, seeing the travel to what was now a living nightmare had taken them the whole day.
Let's call it a day. As much as I want to get out of here, I know we can't go without rest. I'll take the first watch. 3 hours, tops.
Shimmering didn't speak a word, only nodded her head in agreement. She was too dumbfounded by her reality to even think straight, knowing she'd be sleeping with one eye open the entire night. She laid down on the ground and got as comfortable as her current state of mind would let her, closed her eyes, and pretended to sleep. It would be a long night for both of them, but little did they know that the monsters were only the beginning. The true nightmare had already begun. They just didn't know it yet.